make it, please just let us know, contact us, and we'll be happy to send the recording to them at the end of this meeting. That's all I have. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Avideh John for a brief history of the bans, how we should be referring to the bans and why, and the passage of the No Ban Act and what that means for us.
Thank you, Javaneh, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. As was mentioned, my name is Avideh Moussavian. I am the Director of Federal Advocacy at the National Immigration Law Center. And we are an organization that is specifically focused on advancing the rights and opportunities of immigrants with low income. So we often are working at the intersection of economic justice issues and immigration issues. So our involvement in terms of how we started to first engage in fighting the various iterations of these bans was, of course, we remember with true horror and fear what it felt like back in January 2017 in anticipation of these bans. And NILC, my organization, was among the first organizations to sue the federal government for the first and many iterations of these different bans. And we also felt that it was crucial to work more closely with organizations that were directly serving the communities that were most harmed by these various policies. And so we helped put together the No Muslim Ban Ever campaign, which is in partnership with Empower Change, Advancing Justice in the San Francisco Bay Area, Council on American Islamic Relations in the San Francisco Bay Area, and Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. And so as a result of that, with over 200 endorsing organizations, we have been involved in fighting these various iterations of the ban, both in the courts, in Congress, and also through community services and education, and making sure that people understand both the impact of the ban and how to engage in ways that prevent these bans in the future. So as Javaneh mentioned, one of the sort of signature day one administrative actions under the Biden presidency was to follow through on his commitment to rescind the various versions and iterations of what are referred to as the Muslim and African bans. And, it was mentioned at the beginning, like, let's talk about why we even refer to them that way. And from our perspective, it was very important to refer to these bans in that framing, particularly because often when we see them referred to as travel bans, well, that's like one component of the ways in which the bans were impacting people. It was essentially a way to minimize, I think, and by design, the last administration wanted to minimize the impact of the bans. And so for us, it was very important to really remind people from a narrative perspective, and when we look back historically, that this is actually one policy that's part of a much larger pattern and practice of targeting people who either because they are perceived to be Muslim or are Muslim, and also rooted, as we saw under the last administration, in a pattern of many other policies that were also rooted in anti-Blackness and anti-African policies. And so on day one of the Biden administration, it was very important, not just from a for symbolic reasons, but also to really see that President Biden followed through on a promise that he made on the campaign, in really recognizing that these were policies that were in the first week of the Trump administration, that they were implemented immediately. And to see that issue, knowing that there are many other things that the administration is paying attention to see the Biden administration follow through on that promise and that commitment was an important and crucial moment. I will also say it was what we consider to be sort of an initial step, a first step, really the floor of what needed to be done, because obviously just simply undoing the harms of the last administration on paper is not enough, but how you actually implement and operationalize those changes in a meaningful way so that people who are here in the US or in other countries and can't get their applications processed they're not going to necessarily feel that there's any change, practically speaking, in policy until the administration follows through. But as a first step measure, it was crucially important to see that, that the administration took that step. And specifically, if you look at the language of the proclamation that President Biden signed, it was really important, I think, for historical purposes, because it not only rescinded the various iterations of the bans in their entirety, it recognized them as discriminatory and inconsistent with our history of religious liberty. It recognized and used language that recognized that pain has been inflicted on people who have been kept apart because of these bans, that they serve no purpose in terms of protecting us, and in fact actually harmed our standing internationally, and that it had language that acknowledged that the bans are, quote, a stain on our national conscience, and in fact undermined national security. So that language is really important, again, from the narrative perspective, as much as we are trying to advance policy goals by changing laws in Congress or winning in courts, to really truly have these policy and litigation changes have meaning. It's crucial for people to understand from a narrative perspective what it means and why we're actually changing these policies, not because it in the moment is the right thing to do, but just zooming out and noting historically what it means to undo these policies is really critical. We have seen, for example, when we talk about during World War II, the incarceration of people of Japanese descent, oftentimes that is referred to as internment. Again, language really matters. And so to have the highest office in the country, to have the president recognize the harms of the Muslim and African bans and to call them by that, I think is going to have a lot of significance historically when we have some distance between this moment now and look back on it. I also want to talk a little bit about the fact that, I know Mahsa is going to discuss a little bit some of the things that we still need to see happen at the State Department level. For example, we were waiting as part of the announcement on day one of the Biden administration for there to be a report issued after the first 45 days with recommendations and findings. And I think probably many of us were quite disappointed to see that there was not much of significance in that. So really trying to figure out how to hold the administration accountable to ensure that, it wasn't just the act of signing that proclamation. It has to be accompanied with a real meaningful commitment to, as much as possible, redressing the harm. So there are countless people who were deterred from ever applying for visas during the 4 years of the Trump administration because they either, believed that it'd be impossible to be granted a waiver, it would be impossible to ever be able to come to the United States, and they didn't want to risk, their safety, the financial expense, the emotional toll of just hoping without any end in sight. So we can never know the damage or quantify the number of people who simply never applied because they were deterred from doing so.
Sorry, I think hopefully you all can still hear me. Okay. But there are people that we can quantify in terms of those who actually applied and either were denied wrongfully because of the bans or as a result of just their applications going nowhere. For those individuals, we would hope that the State Department would take measures to reopen those cases, to not require anybody to have to pay fees, to ensure that those cases are given expedited consideration, and to make sure that they are reviewed without any prejudice. So there's not, for example, a prior illegitimate denial because of the bans should not count against them in future immigration benefits. And I know Mahsa will talk a little bit more about some of the ways to redress the harms for diversity visa lottery winners who are unable to ever use that opportunity to come to the US. In Congress last summer, the House of Representatives passed the No Ban Act. That bill is significant because not only last year, in the version that was passed last year, not only did it rescind all of the various different Muslim and African bans, it also took existing immigration law and more narrowly tailored it to ensure that any future president, regardless of what administration is in power, has limits to its currently relatively boundless authority to restrict the entry of people who are not US nationals. That's an important step because, again, it really is sort of a base level floor to ask for the bad policies to be rescinded, but what are we going to do to make sure prospectively we don't have this problem again? So people are not having to live their lives one administration to the next with that kind of uncertainty. It's really it was an important step to show that Congress believed that the executive branch can't simply rewrite on its own immigration laws and circumvent congressional authority. And so that was really significant. And also the bill includes language explicitly protecting people against discrimination under our immigration laws on the basis of religion. And it also includes language that would explicitly prohibit nationality-based bans. So there has to be something that is more narrowly tailored than simply where a person was born. The bill was reintroduced in the House of Representatives in February. There were a number of bills that were passed in the last Congress that in this new Congress, the House of Representatives said, for any bills that were previously passed in the last 2 years, we will allow an opportunity for them to be put on an expedited fast track where they don't need to go through the process of being marked up or amended, and instead can go directly to the House floor for a vote. So we saw that sort of special treatment given to other bills that passed in the last Congress. Unfortunately, that was not done with the No Ban Act. What that now means is that the bill will have to get marked up again through the committee process. I will note that it is likely that that markup process will happen in the next week or so, that the language that was in the reintroduced version this Congress is actually an improvement upon what was passed last year. So our hope is that that improved language stays intact and that in the next couple of weeks, that once again, the House of Representatives will vote on and pass the No Ban Act. You may have also heard that much of the language in the No Ban Act was included in the president's immigration bill, the US Citizenship Act, which was introduced in both the House and the Senate in February of this year as well. So I will just note that it was important to see that the Biden administration, in addition to following through on its commitment to rescind the bans, it also took the step of including language to prevent future bans in its sort of visionary immigration bill that really covers a lot of topics. So we were very happy to see that that language was included in that bill. The path to passage remains uncertain. And so, it's important in the meantime that we continue to find ways to hold the administration accountable and not have them feel like they just did what they needed to do without really fully appreciating the fact that there is a massive trust deficit with the communities that have been impacted by these policies. And so it's really incumbent on the Biden administration to go above and beyond to try to rehabilitate and restore that trust that, understandably has been really shattered for a lot of our communities. And with that, I will pass it on to Mahsa.
Thank you, Avideh John. That's hopeful discussion. I'm not in the practice of immigration. I don't know what that means for immigrant lawyers, but it all sounds like good news. Next, we have Mahsa John, who will be discussing the State Department and the visa issues.
Thank you, Javaneh, John. As Avideh, explained, President Biden rescinded the Muslim and Africa travel bans on his first day in office, but that didn't by itself address what to do about all of those thousands of cases that had been denied over the last 3 to 4 years. And so within that proclamation, he also ordered the State Department to do an assessment. They had 45 days to review cases, review the situation, and determine how to proceed with all of the cases that had been denied. And so that review did take place, and on March 8th of 2021, the State Department issued its findings of what their plan was. How were they going to deal with all of these cases under what the law said they were able to do? So the findings of this came up with a few scenarios. So the first is that cases that were denied after January 20th of 2020, those cases could seek re-adjudication by the State Department without submitting a new visa application and without submitting any new fees, provided that the underlying petition was still valid, right? That the family relationship was still there or the employment relationship was still there. So those cases, are in a pretty good place. The State Department said, we're going to reopen those. No new application is required. No new fee is required. However, for cases that were denied before January 20th, 2020, those cases would be reconsidered, but a new DS-260 application would be required and new fees would have to be paid. And so this is the area where most of us are quite unhappy with what the State Department has come up with, and we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail. And there is, ongoing advocacy on trying to get the administration to change its position on that. When it comes to the diversity visa lottery winners from January 2017, from 2017 to 2020, the State Department is arguing that those cases are statutorily barred from being processed and visas being reissued because the deadline passed. So the diversity visa lottery, as we know, that adjudication process of the visa application must take place before September 30th of that fiscal year. And so the State Department is now claiming, sorry, we can't do anything to help you, the law doesn't let us. Whether or not that's true or not, or whether or not a challenge could be made to that is something that's still ongoing and can be correlated to certain litigation that was filed last year related to diversity visa lotteries applications as well, because we saw a significant slowdown, obviously during COVID-19. And how that impacted embassies' processing abilities. And a lawsuit has been, several lawsuits actually were filed, and some judges ordered that the State Department had to reserve or set aside a number of visa applications for those individuals so that they could be adjudicated in later years. So there is talk about how that could be done for any of the travel ban cases, and whether or not you could come up with any unique arguments about cases that have been delayed from years ago versus cases that are not proceeding in that particular year is one for the litigation attorneys, but there is ongoing litigation there. The thing that's important to note from what the State Department has said when it comes to a new application, it doesn't mean that a new I-130 application or a family petition is required, or a new I-140 immigrant worker petition is required. It's only that a new DS-260 application is needed. So that's just kind of the broad picture of what that review came up with, what their proposal is, or how they plan to proceed at the State Department and at the embassy, the big picture. I'm going to go into some details, but first, I think the context of what's happening at the State Department and what's happening at US embassies and consulates around the world is really critical as part of this discussion. So essentially, the State Department has imploded from within under the Trump administration. Lack of resources, a lack of staff, a lack of key policy persons, and obviously a lack of morale. And so the State Department has had significant issues even before COVID. And then add on top of it how COVID-19 impacted embassies' ability to process applications. And you see that there's significant backlog that's developed over the last year in particular. So two things. One, staffing is constrained because of COVID-19 and consular officers, foreign service officers being able to transfer between different embassies Officers are not stationed at one embassy for their entire life. They alternate and spend 2 to 3 years to sometimes 5 years, depending on what their position is. And then once they finish their tour at one embassy, they're transferred to another embassy or back to DC. All of that was impacted by COVID and the difficulties related to social distancing and keeping staff and people that go to the embassy safe. Then you have the resources are limited. Again, due to funding issues, but also due to significant backlog that developed not only under the Trump administration, but due to COVID-19. So to give you an idea of what are some of these numbers, what does this backlog look like? So to give you an idea, for immigrant visa applications, those that are leading to a green card, okay, as opposed to non-immigrant visas, which are temporary work visas or student visas or visitor visas. So immigrant visa categories, we have 90% of our US embassies around the world are processing some applications, okay? But it's limited processing. So no embassy is operating at full capacity. 90% are operating at limited capacity. And the priority is being given to immigrant visa applications, to green card applications. Out of the non-immigrant visa applications and embassies, only 43 out of 233 consulates around the world are processing routine non-immigrant visa applications. That means that the rest are closed but for emergency services, like, again, student visa applications are being given priority, or other urgent, US citizen services. So 190 US consulates around the world and embassies around the world are operating on an emergency only basis. So that gives you a sense of what's happened this last 1 year. All of those cases that have built up are now in the pipeline, in this backlog, waiting to be interviewed. And this doesn't even include all of the applications that are still in the United States at either a service center or at the National Visa Center, waiting to be scheduled and assigned to a US embassy. So to give you a sense of the number of visa applications, before COVID-19, the State Department issued roughly 10 million visas a year. 500,000 of that were for green card based applications or immigrant visa applications. 9.5 million were non-immigrant visa applications, those temporary ones. In the past, a year ago, 2 years ago, in January 2020, a year and a few months ago, the National Visa Center, the agency in the United States that prepares green card files for the embassies to be interviewed, they used to have 75,000 cases pending, ready to be scheduled for an interview. In just February of this year, that number has jumped 6 to 7 times to 473,000 cases. So this is all of the cases all around the world, right? I'm not talking about just the Muslim and Africa travel ban cases, but this context is important because all of those Muslim and Africa travel ban cases are now kind of, let's say, competing, for lack of a better word, right? But they're all in this big pool together, waiting to be adjudicated by embassies. So the numbers are astronomical. The good thing, at least for most of the Muslim and Africa travel ban cases, are that many of them were denied for immigrant visas. And immigrant visas are what the State Department is prioritizing over all other applications. And what they've said that they're going to do is they're going to prioritize, obviously, the US citizen family members first, and then minor children and fiancés, and then parents and that type of thing. But also they realize that these Muslim and Africa travel ban cases have been around for 3 years now, and they need to be processed. Now, the good thing is that many of those cases had already been interviewed. And then were denied. So what we have, I think, over 40,000, 45,000 cases by some numbers, at least by the State Department number, of cases that were denied. They were all interviewed and then, subsequently denied, or let's say stuck in administrative processing. So that means that the majority of them do not need to be interviewed again. And now all a consular officer really needs to do is review the case and determine, are the conditions still the same, right? Do they still meet the eligibility requirements? of being a family member or having that job offer. And then you have updated documents that might need to be provided to the embassy. So the embassies have really decided to do two things. I'm sorry, there we go. So they've done two things. One, they said that we're going to reopen these cases that had been denied, and that updated medical exams or biometrics will be needed. If the medical exams are over a year old, they said you need to do a new medical exam. And if, let's say, it's a child that's now turned 14 or older, they will need to have their biometrics done or fingerprinting done. So those individuals can travel to that third country, which is what most Iranians and Yemenis and Syrians have had to do. They can travel to the other country, have their medical exam redone, have the biometrics or fingerprints redone, and submit it to the embassy with no need to go back to the embassy again. So that's the good thing that's come out of all of this, is they don't need to go back for an interview. How are these cases going to be reopened is a secondary issue that we still have not heard from the State Department regarding what their official plan is. But we do have anecdotal evidence from individuals and other attorneys that the embassies are going through their cases and reopening denied cases, and reaching out oftentimes to the applicants to let them know that your case has been reopened. Or individuals can go online and actually track their case on the embassy website and find out, has it been reopened or not. And what we've been advising attorneys and individuals to do is, if you haven't heard from the embassy yet and your case was one of the ones that was denied, then send an email to the embassy and notify them, remind them. You're basically pinging your case to bring it to the top so that the embassy can make sure that it's reopened. Now, all of that information I gave you regarding the delays and all of the cases in the queue, the context for that is important, that if it's a case that had not yet been interviewed, it's going to need an interview. And we don't know how long that will take. The good news could be that your case was already at an embassy. It already had an interview date, for example, scheduled, but it was canceled because of COVID-19. We know that those cases are kind of first in line, compared to all of those, let's say 500,000 cases that are sitting at the National Visa Center waiting to get to the embassy. So that's the good news for many of the travel ban cases that had been denied. The bad news is, how are they going to find the resources to get to all of these cases, to identify them, to reopen them, to reach out to the applicants and ask for updated biometrics, to ask for new biometrics for children that hadn't needed it before, the new medical exams? We don't know yet. So it could be many, many months before an applicant will hear about what happened with their case. I'm estimating it could be anywhere from 6 months to 8 months, particularly depending on the embassy. And we know that, for example, for Iranians, Ankara, Yerevan, and Abu Dhabi were the designated embassies for these immigrant visa applications. Plus, we know that there are some certain problems and backlogs at those embassies. Abu Dhabi, for example, is making it difficult for Iranians to obtain visas to get there in case they need to go back. Yerevan has said that they're not interested and don't have the capacity to take any transfers, and the same with Ankara. So for any of the cases that had not yet been interviewed, that are kind of stuck in the queue to be interviewed, those are the ones that are going to have a little bit more of a maze of trying to get through to get to an interview finally, versus those that only need updated documents and passports to be mailed into the embassy. So essentially the key takeaways are, first in, first out. Hopefully your case is going to be one that the embassy will be able to reopen itself. 2, follow up with the embassy if you haven't heard from them yet, with a simple email with just concise information for the officer about what last transpired on the case. You don't want to send in a 3-page, 4-page, 10-page memo by any means, because it's more work for that officer that's already overburdened and doesn't have enough time to get to. So I hope that we're going to get more information from the State Department, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA. We have a State Department liaison committee that I'm a part of, And we're going to be meeting with the State Department next month. And I'm soliciting questions from the immigration bar and from anyone else that's interested in sending me a proposed question that we're going to try to pose to the State Department to make sure that they really set a clear plan in place on how to deal with all these cases. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mahsa John. That was very informative. Next, we're going to go to Azadeh Shahshahani. She's going to talk to us about the need for accountability in light of the extent of the harm that was done to the communities affected by the bans.
Thank you so much, Javaneh John, and I'm also honored to be on the same panel with Avideh and Mahsa, and thank you all also for your really informative presentations. You know, while the repeal of the ban by the Biden administration is a step in the right direction, it's not nearly enough, right? I mean, what happens to the pain that our communities experienced as a result of the Muslim ban during the entirety of the Trump administration? So we must acknowledge the harms and demand accountability. So one powerful framework for demanding such accountability is people's tribunals, which have proved effective in exposing human rights violations and pressuring state actors to take responsibility. And the first official people's tribunal that we know of was the Russell Tribunal that focused on the US government conduct in Vietnam in the 1960s, and since then, probably thousands of people's tribunals have been held in the US and around the world. And so they can be critical in situations like this one, where domestic courts have effectively sanctioned an act, even though its enforcement has implicated the US government in a number of human rights violations. So we saw, obviously, the Supreme Court, unfortunately, the US Supreme Court, in a very shameful decision, upheld the Muslim ban in June of 2018. So, you know, at least in the immediate future, domestic courts may not be the best avenue for seeking redress, even though, you know, there could be creative litigation that I'm sure, you know, lawyers are going to look into and are still taking on. But people's tribunals are also, again, an alternative to pursue, and they're forums for justice initiated by grassroots organizations, social justice movements, organizers, lawyers, and academics. And these forums provide a space to adjudicate charges against the state, so in this case, the US government, and, you know, particularly the Trump administration, outside of the formal judicial system. And unlike proceedings that involve state bodies, such as congressional investigations or litigation, people's tribunals are not beholden to government bureaucracy in their truth finding and exposing missions. And so the format of these tribunals mirrors that of a trial. So lawyers typically take up the roles of prosecutors and defense attorneys. Community members, legal scholars, and judges act as jurors, and individuals directly affected by the legislation or the issue at hand come forward to provide testimony describing their experience. And though the tribunals do not hold legal authority themselves, they do help gather evidence that can be used by judicial forums, such as the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court does have the authority to take on cases or launch investigation based on information that is brought to light through a tribunal. And alternatively, people's tribunals can help develop stronger foundations to launch more effective subsequent federal investigations, such as, you know, an investigation by Congress at some point. So while people's tribunals may not be the sole accountability mechanism appropriate to address the harms of the Muslim ban, they can play an important role in exposing the human rights violations committed by Trump and those who aided him. Also, these tribunals serve important accountability goals by directing international attention to grave abuses of human rights in various countries, and by forcing governing bodies and the public to reckon with national histories. So, for example, in 2016, the International Tribunal for Democracy in Brazil called attention to a situation quickly spiraling into fascism when then President-elect Dilma Rousseff was unjustly impeached and former Vice President Michel Temer took over without holding elections. And I should mention that I was honored to be part of that tribunal, and we submitted a verdict of basically saying that what was happening was a coup against a legitimately elected government. So back to the US, the United States' long history of white supremacy and legislation based in white supremacy, like the Muslim ban, that is built on this history, can be addressed in present day through people's tribunals, where witnesses can also make the case for remedy in the form of reparations. And finally, people's tribunals differ from formal judicial proceedings in that one of the tribunal's primary purposes is to center and prioritize the narrative of those directly affected. These narratives are often in danger of getting buried when they are up against voices of state officials in lengthy and complex judicial and legislative processes. And there are countless people, as we know, who still need to tell their stories and accounts of being harmed through the Muslim ban, and they need to get closure. These stories deserve to be told in forums that center and honor the individuals who lived through them. And only once those stories are heard and the harm addressed can directly impacted communities find a measure of peace. And I would like to share an example of a people's tribunal against the Muslim ban that we held in Atlanta. In the fall of 2017, when the US Supreme Court delayed the hearing that was supposed to have on the second version of the Muslim ban, we in Atlanta decided that, okay, we're gonna go ahead with our own people's tribunal. Because at the end of the day, we don't really need the Supreme Court to tell us that the Muslim ban is abhorrent and it needs to be repealed. We as people know that. And also, the voices of those who have been impacted by the Muslim ban need to be heard. And so we organized this this tribunal focused on the Muslim ban. And so, we had a jury composed of people's tribunals. We had a defense team, a prosecution team. And most importantly, like the most important part of any people's tribunal, were the folks who were directly impacted by the Muslim ban. So family members, suffering through separation for several years, community-based organizations. So for example, a representative from the Somali community organization showed up and talked about various community members being impacted by the ban. And then having been provided all the testimony, the jury then deliberated and came back with a verdict of guilty against the Trump administration and against the Muslim ban for having caused the various human rights violations that it did against our community members. And that verdict of guilty that came about as a result of a people's tribunal, a tribunal that centered people's voices, still stands, regardless of the really shameful decision rendered by the Supreme Court in June 2018. So, I hope that people will, take a look at people's tribunals, either for the issue of the Muslim ban or other injustices that, you're facing or your community is facing, and perhaps look into organizing a people's tribunal. And I'm gonna share an article for folks who are interested in perhaps organizing one that I wrote for the National Lawyers Guild blog on sort of the history of people's tribunals, in case you'd like to learn further. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Azadeh Jan. That was very interesting. So I guess I'm gonna read some questions to you, although I think they all center around the DV visas that were denied between 2017 to 2020. So let's read the first question. Could you discuss the current situation on diversity visas 2017 to 2020 that were subject to Presidential Proclamation 9645, which I think Mahsa already may have addressed, but if you wanted to address it again. The second part of the question is that if the charities you represent would support them. Yemenis have been quite active on the media, rallying in New York and discussing their issues with some congressmen and senators. Who would like to take on that question?
I mean, I can just kind of reiterate what I mentioned earlier, that, I mean, unfortunately, the way the immigration laws are written, a visa has to be issued in that particular fiscal year for diversity visa lottery winners. And when that year runs out, like when that time period runs out, that visa opportunity is lost. Now, there was a lawsuit filed last year by both AILA, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and some other organizations, plus some attorneys that said, hey, look, that's not fair because of the immigrant visa ban, a different ban instituted by the Trump administration. You know, that's not fair. These cases should still be able to move forward and shouldn't be stuck and lost once September 30th goes by. And one of the judges ruled in their favor, saying that, yes, I'm going to set aside, you know, 9,000 roughly cases. But that was that same fiscal year when those visa numbers were still available and could be set aside. You need to really talk to a litigation attorney that kind of understands all of those intricacies of how that argument could be framed for cases that have, you know, 3 years have gone by. I'm not an expert on that area. And so, you know, I made a suggestion, obviously reach out to your elected officials and let them know about the damage and harm that this has caused. You know, Azadeh just talked about the tribunals. That's a really important avenue to follow. And then, of course, you know, reaching out to some of these organizations that do litigate and finding out, you know, can some argument be crafted to take this issue on?
I can also add, for the same reasons that Mahsa said, that there are very limited options for what the State Department is currently able to do. And so a couple of possibilities could be, for example, that it's possible to, for example, grant parole, humanitarian parole to people who were supposed to have been issued visas under the diversity visa lottery. Alternatively, if we want to really restore people to the place they should have been in, if there had been none of these bans in place, Congress can do something. And so it's very difficult to get a bill on its own to pass, just because, you know, even though one party controls both chambers, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, it's by a very narrow margin. But there are certain bills that are considered quote unquote must pass legislation. So for example, keeping the government operational and funded, that's necessary every year. So through the appropriations process, there are organizations that are exploring the possibility of, could there be language added to the appropriations process that basically allows people to recapture those unused visas that they were never allowed to use? We obviously would want to do that in a way that doesn't then quickly eat up the current fiscal year's visas. So do it in a way where you're not harming people who are currently in the process or will be in the process next year, for example. So there's creative things that we're trying to explore to get Congress to do something. Some of those things may be quieter and under the radar if that's just an easier approach to do it because it's a more technical thing. But you know, from the executive branch, unfortunately, it's very difficult without Congress intervening, because as Mahsa said, you know, this is how immigration law is written. So there has to actually be a legislative fix in some cases.
Thank you so much. Mali, John, does that answer your question? I think everyone may have answered your question. If you still have a question, feel free to type it into the chat box. And I have Sahar who raised her hand. Sahar John, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks so much for the great informative session. I have a question that is not 100% relative to Muslim ban, but it's related to the limitations that has been imposed on Iranian-Americans through sanctions. And please stop me if you think it's not appropriate for this forum. but I'm a scientist, and I have been asked by universities in Iran to give, for example, high-level scientific, presentation there. But I'm always, on the other hand, I receive some emails that, it's against, sanctions, or, we should be concerned about having any scientific collaboration in Iran with Iranians. So can you at least guide me to the right resources to study that and figure out what is against law and what is not against law, to have a clear, knowledge about that? Very appreciated.
I would suggest reaching out to NIAC, unless other folks on this call have the information that they would like to share, because they follow U.S. sanctions and their impact on, Iranians and Iranian-Americans closely. So I'll put the link to their website in the chat, and I know, they check their email quite frequently, and they're in touch with a network of lawyers. So hopefully they'll be able to assist you or at least guide you in the right direction.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I don't think we have any other questions in the chat box, but I did think of 2 questions that I wrote down. My first question is, what can we do to help the passage of the No Ban Act?
So, as I mentioned, the House of Representatives will most likely vote on the bill in the next couple of weeks. I think that we are confident that it will pass the House again. The challenge, as with last time, was what will happen in the Senate. Right now, everything related to immigration is, of course, a bit sensitive and obviously gets very politicized. And even though what is happening at the border is completely separate from the bans, people will often conflate these issues in order to make it seem like all of these problems are stemming from the same, like the root causes, when in fact they're entirely different issues. So I think that the challenge is, in the last Congress, there was a Senate version of the No Ban Act. It was identical in language. We didn't expect it to go anywhere under the Trump administration. It was the furthest we really thought we could get anything to happen was in the House of Representatives. But now we have a Biden administration. We have, by a razor-thin margin, Democrats who control the Senate. But I think that there still needs to be a lot of work to build support, even among Democrats in the Senate. I think contacting your member of Congress is crucial. I think even if you have a senator who already supports the bill, having them hear again that you need them to do more than that, to really talk about the issue, to be a champion, reminding them of your clients' stories or your community's stories. People are still not reunited. It's not like the ban, it's not like a stroke of a pen suddenly undid the pain and the harm of the last 4 years. It's also never possible to regain the lost time or the lost experiences, or just the chilling effect that has been created as a result of the last 4 years. So for them to really understand the importance of this issue, like the work is not done simply by saying we're going to get rid of the old bans, that people really need to see a commitment to ensuring that these bans are never, ever repeated again. So I think, having, if you have networks in other places where senators haven't yet signed on, having your community members reach out to their senators is going to be very important. I think there is a real question as to whether or not we see all kinds of immigration bills move in the Senate. So I don't know, I mentioned that the No Ban Act exists on its own, but it's also part of President Biden's immigration bill. And so there is a question as to whether or not there will be an attempt to move that much bigger bill with the No Ban Act as part of it. I would say that is a much bigger challenge. So it's just important to build the record for support. So even if in the next 2 years in this current Congress, we don't see the Senate pass the bill, the idea is every time it gets reintroduced, every new Congress, to be able to continue to show a track record where more and more people are supporting it. So for example, I think last time there were 34 senators who signed on to it. That obviously does not represent even all of the Democrats. I think there's more work to be done to make it a bipartisan bill, but at a minimum, there's a lot of moderate Democrats, for example, who could still be supporting the bill. So I think that will be really helpful. I will say one of the challenges, unfortunately, is the fact that the administration right now is dealing with a lot of issues at the border, and that has sort of swallowed up a lot of the energy and political conversation around any issue related to immigration. Again, no matter how unrelated it is to unaccompanied children and Central America, but that's just the political reality. But none of that should get in the way of, you know, the gradual building of support. The many of us who worked on introducing the bill, we were always very aware it was not going to be something that passed in 2 years or maybe even 5 years. Maybe it's going to take longer. It's a lot easier to get people to support something like rescinding the bans, because that is very much a rebuke of Trump. It is it's a much bigger deal to get people to limit future presidential authority, because for any party in power, they're a little nervous to do that. So that part of it, we always knew was going to be a longer term fight, but that never deterred us from saying we have to start somewhere.
I'd love to just add on to what Avideh John just explained. That's really important to understand. I work with a lot of congressional offices, and they all tell me, without any exceptions, that the best way to have your voice really heard is by sending an individual email, not signing on to those mass campaigns, you know, which are nice. I mean, obviously it's nice to have, you know, 1,000 people sign on to an email or submit an email through a form online, but those are just noise and are not really looked at. You can go ahead and copy and paste and, you know, personalize it, and then send the individual email or send it via your elected officials' website if they have one of those forms to submit online. But submitting like a mass petition does not really get anywhere, unfortunately. So when you do reach out to your elected officials, please be sure to personalize it and send it personally from your email to the elected officials' email.
Thank you. And Mahsa John, on the topic of reaching out to our elected officials, you stated in your discussion that you were meeting with the State Department officials and you were gathering questions. I'm sure that the IACC and IABA members will want to know how to reach out to you and how to send questions to you. If you don't mind sharing your contact information.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
With a deadline. So like, when is the deadline that we have to send the question to you?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then this is a whole new topic about people who served in the SEPA, which I know has been a hot topic in the DMV area anyway, from some local attorneys that I'm friends with. Ali Reza sent a question. I don't know, it's 8 p.m. now. Do you want to take on the question, the topic of SEPA?
I can just briefly address it because it is another whole huge area within all of the stuff that Iranians are facing. But essentially, yes, we're seeing mass denials of non-immigrant visas, of immigrant visas, of refusing entry to the United States, even of dual Canadian Iranian citizens, for example. Based on this, we're trying to reach out on multiple levels to the Biden administration and to the State Department, saying that there need to be carve-outs, that you can't deny, or you shouldn't deny, based on terrorism grounds, if someone engaged in their military service before April 2019, when SEPA and IRGC were designated as terrorist organizations. We haven't gotten anything official back yet, but the more people that reach out and challenge this by presenting legal arguments to the State Department, the better. And so definitely, you know, if you can, you should hire an attorney to help with that and submit a request to reconsider to the State Department. It's something that we're working on multiple cases and working with CBP and the Biden administration on.
And I'm aware of some class action type lawsuits that may be coming that are in the works for SEPA servants, military servants. Someone asked the question of if you guys have any ideas on how we can shorten our visa clearance or administrative processing for Iranian Americans.
I have just one bit of advice. The more information you give to the US State Department before they process your visa application, the easier it makes it for them to verify you are who you say you are, and that you haven't engaged in something that would make you ineligible. So wherever you worked, wherever you've gone to school, list it all, because it makes it easier for them to vet you. Part of it is just, you know, the problems of, you know, Big Brother and looking at everything and from everybody. And we see more and more cases of individuals being banned based on terrorism bars because their brother was friends with somebody that had their car worked on by, you know, someone that was wanted by the FBI or something like that. Now, obviously for Iranian cases, it's a little bit different because the US government doesn't even have much information on Iranians. It's not like Pakistan or other countries where we see there's intelligence sharing between the agencies. So it's really case specific. And unfortunately, I mean, Iranians get stuck in this a lot based on the field of study, you know, what you might have studied at university or where you might have worked in Iran, and if it was a sanctioned agency. And obviously we're hoping under the Biden administration, there will be some changes. But again, telling your elected officials about how this is impacting you personally, your work, your family, your community goes a long way.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. And I think we're done here. Thank you so much to the IACC and to our wonderful panelists for patiently answering all of our questions.
Also, yeah, I would like to thank on behalf of IACC to all of you for taking the time and sharing all of this good information. It was a very informative session for myself because like every one of us, we have a family member or a friend that they have similar questions. So that was really good. And I appreciate the time that you took. And if you would like, I know that Mahsa Jan shared her email. If you would like, you can share your email in the chat box for the audience in case they need to ask you further question if you are interested. Thanks again to IABA DC chapter and Javaneh and Golnush for coordinating this session. Typically, we try to have a quarterly session with IABA DC chapter on different topics. So please be in the lookout for our next joint event together. Thanks again for your time and have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.